Hello, everyone. I'm Miriam Bale. I'm the artistic director of the Indie Memphis Film Festival. Thank you so much for joining us for another one of our movie club talks. And we are so honored now to have the director of our featured film this week, Spaceship Earth. And the director is Matt Wolf. Welcome, Matt.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. You're joining us from New York, and you've been doing we're so thrilled to have you. Matt is a director of documentaries. He's directed Wild Combination, a documentary on Arthur Russell, a great film. He's directed Recorder, the Marion Stokes Project, and Teenage, as well as other projects. And this latest film, Matt, I'm very curious how you, so how did you first stumble upon this topic and decide to make this your latest project?
I was just doing internet research, which is pretty much how I find most of my film ideas. And I came across this really striking image of 8 people in bright red jumpsuits, like the band Devo, in front of a glowing glass pyramid. And I thought it was a still from a science fiction film, but in fact, it is real. And the structure behind them is Biosphere 2. And when I learned more about this story, I was really determined to tell it. And I came across this group called the Synergists who conceived of the project. And I knew nothing of the prehistory of Biosphere 2. But when I went to their ranch in New Mexico, I was brought into this kind of temperature controlled room that had hundreds of 16mm films and analog videotapes and thousands of images. And I was just astonished. It was a really singular archive. And it felt like just an extraordinary opportunity and a big responsibility to tell this story because as I understood in my initial research, it was really, discounted as this spectacular failure. And I felt that 25 years had passed, and in the context of catastrophic climate change, there was a certain prescience to the story that begged for reappraisal.
Absolutely. There's so many really interesting themes. There's climate change, this proportion of carbon and oxygen in the air. It's a beautiful story of the evolution of boomers. There's so much there. And then there's also this really interesting angle where these are theater people. And in a way, this was kind of an early reality show, something we were just talking about before we began. And so I'm sure all of those themes are what drew you to it, but could you say something about what you thought the project might be as you were beginning it and what you were surprised that it became?
It's funny, I was just talking with my boyfriend about this, contemplating new projects, and I have a lot of ambivalence when I start films, if we want to have real talk here. And I think it's a long process of kind of trying to find myself in the material. I would never make a film about myself and have my own voice in a film, but it's pretty important for me to find my interests in a film. And it starts from a pretty logical place of, this is a compelling story. It's prescient. There's incredible underlying material and subjects. It's a dramatic story. But then it takes me a while to figure out why me? Why am I making this? Why am I interested in it? And I obviously, as you can see in the film, gravitated to the prehistory. I am really interested in unusual stories about counterculture. And this group really defied categories of hippies, and they had a particular angle on the 1970s back to the land commune movement that was unique, particularly because they identified as capitalists. And that model thrust them into a very unusual interdisciplinary space that was outside of any established institutions. But I was really intrigued that they were artists, because I do think a common attribute of artists is that they endeavor to reimagine the world. And what was compelling to me about Biosphere 2 was that it was a project in which a group of people aimed to reimagine literally a world. And within that world, not only were there ecological calamities, but it's the human element, brought up so much precarity that the project in so many ways unraveled. But I also, as I was making the film, came to really see the theme of small groups, which I tried to emphasize in the material, is that this is a story about small groups and how they're a viable model for achieving new ideas. And I thought that was kind of instructive towards the world today. It seems, I mean, and I obviously made this film before we were all quarantined like Biospherians. So that whole element was not intent, could never have been imagined and intended. But I think, you know, in our times right now, the idea of consensus among a large body of people globally just feels completely implausible. But the idea that we can tweak the idea of community to be small groups, and that we can accomplish things with those small groups if we share goals and combine varied experiences, felt very applicable to the troubled world, and it feels even more applicable now. And so I think in all those senses, I found my interest, and I found something I could grasp on and think about in ways that expanded beyond the story of the film.
And not to project too much, but obviously there's a connection to the way films are made in small groups,
Totally.
at least
Totally.
with documentary films. Yeah, I really love that theme is towards the end, especially now in the moment that we are with, you know, vacillating between kind of hopelessness and isolation. That's a really, it's you couldn't have ended the film with a better message for right now, which is really funny, since this premiered at Sundance before we were all in quarantine. How has the premiere, how is this unusual, I saw your film in its premiere while I was not in New York, but while the film was streaming outside in New York, and it was, and people were listening through an app on their phones, and it was really, really something. And now you've been doing a series of these conversations. You've been able to travel to so many probably smaller venues than you were usually than you would have. Can you talk a little bit about how this experience of this release has been for you?
It's been a great opportunity for me right now. So many filmmakers haven't had the opportunity to even show their films at a film festival. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity. And, you know, the film was originally going to be released in a pretty wide way theatrically. And I was disappointed briefly when I learned that it wouldn't be. But that was also my wake-up call that this was obviously at the beginning of the quarantine. It was my wake-up call that what's going on is long lasting, and that we're entering a whole new paradigm. So not only was it a wake-up call, but then I realized it made sense. The film is so tied into literally what we're going through, but I think also, I don't know, people need things that aren't about the thing, if you know what I mean. It's like everybody wants to talk about the thing, but they don't want to talk about the thing. And this film is a weird opportunity to reflect on a pretty universal experience that people are sharing right now without having to talk about COVID-19, which is the last thing on earth I'd want to talk about while watching a movie. So it was a unique opportunity. And then in terms of doing virtual events, I really miss being in a movie theater and seeing who the audience of a film is, and seeing who comes up to me afterwards and talks to me like, are young people, what kind of people are watching this film? How do they respond to it? So I miss that. I really, really miss it. And I miss the feeling of going in at the back of the theater and seeing people finish a film. A big thing for filmmakers is when you do Q&As, you kind of step in for the last 2 or 3 minutes of the movie, and you're always nervous you're going to miss the Q&A. I miss that. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to go to Memphis today. I've been all over the country in the past few days, and I wouldn't be in Memphis. So I am grateful to have the opportunity to do that and to have different kinds of conversations, but also the conversations are archived, and it creates a lot more accessibility for people who don't have the means to go to cultural events or the ability. And I appreciate that. So there's positive things about doing virtual programming, but there's also sad things about it.
I have to say, we were also just talking beforehand, and you've obviously become a pro at doing Zoom Q&As, and your lighting and your whole setup is perfection. So do you have any tips for doing Zoom Q&As for someone who, I mean, the truth is we may be doing a lot of these in the future. And I mean, no guesses at this point, but do you have any tips at this
I would say sound is really important. I have a little USB lavalier mic, and I think that makes it a little easier for people to listen to. And then you gotta get your computer up and light your face, you know? But I think here's my thing about Zoom, and this is not an answer to that question. It's really hard to look at a bunch of people all at once. Usually when we're in a conversation, you like turn over here and talk to someone and turn over there. And it's hard to look at yourself all the time when you're talking. I think that is one of the biggest things to adapt to. But anything that physically simulates the experience of talking to people a little bit more is helpful, I think. But in terms of actually doing cultural programming on the internet, I think as you're doing, live streaming to YouTube is the most accessible way to do it, and it archives it so people can come later. And even though it's a little more arduous, doing 45 minutes to an hour is good. People can pop in and out. There's an opportunity to have a more expanded conversation. And yeah, I think it's about also actually really reaching your audience and promoting these so that people, even if they don't go when it happens, they have the opportunity to watch part of a YouTube video, you know? So it's an experiment. I wonder how much it reaches people and if it's meaningful to people. Because I've been doing so much of it, I don't go to any of these things. But now that I have, I think I'm more interested to not even watch them, just to listen to them in the background, you know? So it's unique.
Yeah, those are some of the things we've learned in our experience. We've been doing these for a few weeks, and we definitely feel like we've been able to reach people and reach different people than just our core audience. And it's been really interesting. But you're right, the whole idea of we stream to YouTube, which does a mirror thing. So whenever these are on YouTube, I try to look on my screen at the person I'm talking to, and then once it goes to YouTube, people who are watching on YouTube, it looks like I'm looking the opposite way. So there are definitely
I know.
there's some weird
It's
quirks.
bizarre, yeah.
But okay, I want to ask you, since this is kind of getting towards the end of your Q&As, I want to ask you some real questions. Also in line
Please,
with our
real talk.
real talk. So you had access to this incredible archive, and it's really amazing to see the boat footage, especially.
Mhm.
And yet there's also a theme within the film of, kind of this questioning whether there are aspects of this group that were cult-like, and if John was a kind of cult leader type of person. Did you feel any sort of leniency or extra sort of softness towards the group because they were giving you so much access that made you was there a kind of a line there, or did you fall under the spell of John as well and just find him just this completely charismatic person?
It's a great question because people don't ever consider the practical dimension of collaborating with people to use their footage. And it's a real thing, and it can be a conflict of interest, and it's a thin line. In this case, I was always interested in making a film that was sympathetic to those characters, particularly because they were so harshly rebuked and their story was so flattened, and I found their trajectory to be so compelling. I was very interested in telling their story sympathetically. If I wanted to make a tell-all hit film,
Oh, Matt, we just froze. You just froze in a moment. So let me see if you come back.
something, but
Oh, Matt, I think you just froze. Could you just repeat the last
oh,
bit of what
okay.
you thought? Okay, yeah.
I think, oh, my internet connection's unstable. Am I audible now?
You're totally fine. Just we lost the last bit of what you said.
Okay, I was saying if I wanted to make a hit piece that was really aggressively kind of taking them down as a cult, I wouldn't have had access to the material. That wasn't my creative interest in the story, but I did have creative control over the film, and I was investigative in terms of the accusations of them being a cult. But from my point of view, there was a cult of personality surrounding John Allen, and that he was a mercurial and complex figure who was certainly divisive, but that the sensational media story about them being a cult wasn't something that I could substantiate through my own research and interviewing. Another aspect of the film, since we're doing real talk here, is that it's interesting for people who, I'm someone who makes films that traffic in ambiguity and sometimes in the ambivalence of characters, and that raise lots of questions and that merit further investigation and further question asking, and that don't strive to be definitive. I would say those are aspects of my filmmaking that I try to stick by. But there are, I think, there's a limitation to the critique of the group without many external perspectives. For instance, experts or commentators, historians, people from the science community who weren't explicitly involved in the project, journalists. I really relied on the primary source material to provide that external commentary. And because there was such an intricate network of personalities involved inside the project, I chose to tell the story from their personal and firsthand points of view. And there's a limit in which the film can critique that group through the perspective of those who were inside the story. And I recognize that, but I also, I still stand by the choice to do that instead of having external perspectives. But I've been thinking over the past weeks what it would be like if there were people completely outside of this history and outside of this story bringing their perspective historically to it. It would be a different kind of film, but it would tap into a different types of ideas too.
Yeah, absolutely. And you made that choice, and it certainly works for right now, in that we feel very much within that group and within that family and within there certainly is not without like
Warts.
yeah, absolutely. Quirks
But
and like different
I think
opinion. Yeah.
I think the thing also is that when you're presented with that much archival material of that quality, which I think people take somewhat for granted in this film, that there are multiple angles of like every event depicted, shot well on 16 millimeter. It's like the amount of coverage for the amount of story is, in my experience, unprecedented. And I make all archival films all the time. And so I think people take that for granted a little bit, but when you have that kind of underlying material, you have the opportunity to really be present tense in the story instead of being retrospective. And I do feel that that was really guiding the creative decision making too, is to be present just in the material. You're just, the viewers dropped inside of it. So that was part of why the storytelling really comes from the inside of the personalities who are involved.
That makes sense. Well, speaking of the archival material, I think it's safe to talk about it now because most of the people in this chat have seen it already and it's been out for a while. But the big, surprise in the film is Steve Bannon coming in. At what point did you realize Steve Bannon was part of the story? And did that change anything in the way that you formed the material?
I knew, I think right away. I don't really remember. It's funny because when I started film too, it's a lot of like, it's a puzzle, just thinking about where everything fits. There's not much of an element of surprise to me. The surprise is finding stuff in footage that can support the storytelling. But I think it was just a metaphor laid out on a silver platter of like, these people create a new world and the world's taken over by a contemporary political villain. I mean, it was great, in a way. It was great, the synchronicity of his, and I was making the film when he was still in the administration, instrumental in Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accord. So he really was instrumental in part of our kind of our turn on the biosphere. But yeah, it's funny to me, assuming everyone's seen the film, the big surprise is that they're all still together. And of course, it took me a while to realize from a storytelling audience point of view that is a surprise, because of course I know that they're together. But as I continued to develop the film and tread into its themes, I realized that was kind of the biggest point, is that regardless of the trajectory of what you accomplish or the perception and optics of your life's work, if you develop collaborative relationships that are meaningful and productive and that last, that outweighs ideas of success and failure, and that like the idea that you or I might have relationships that span half a century that create unconventional community and family. That was I think that's surprising. So to me, it's Bannon is a bit of a decoy because he's such a salacious twist, but the real reveal to me is that their relationships last.
Well, that's fascinating as far as revealing the structure and that puzzle making aspect
Mm-hmm.
of forming it. That's really terrific. Speaking of the reveal at the end and how they are family, or as they say, yeah, highly functioning family. I wondered at that point, it crossed my mind, what were they prepared for what would have happened if anyone had gotten pregnant in the 2 years, or did that come up at all?
Well, there were two couples already inside. It wasn't like sexy in there, I think everybody wanted it to be, but my sense is that just wasn't part of the dynamic because there were already two established couples, and um, I imagine they use birth control. I never asked, but also, yeah, that wasn't, I looked for the salacious Big Brother reality TV stuff in there, and it wasn't there. Or at least, even if it was there, it's not how the Biospherians were willing to frame their experience. And I don't actually think sex and sexuality was a big aspect of life inside.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. But I also wonder, the salacious aspect definitely, and that it wasn't sexy. But I also wondered if this wasn't the idea of creating a functioning world, if the idea of reproducing was like, obviously it wasn't part of it, but I wondered what that would
But
have.
there was life cycle in there. Animals gave birth.
Oh, wow, yeah.
There was life cycle, and I think aspects of it in conversations I've had with friends over the weeks that are interesting is they did create a model society to some extent, but I don't think that was their intention. I'm thinking particularly about the whiteness of everybody inside. I was talking to two friends about it yesterday, about how a group of people created a model society that reified the power structures that exist in the original world that they were trying to reimagine. And I think from there, and there's a lot to unpack there in terms of the counterculture and in terms of the kind of blind sights or blindness of what's the word, the blind spots of this group. But I think also from their point of view, they were not creating a model society, they were creating a model ecosystem. And the people who went inside were like astronauts and researchers who were trying to measure its atmospheric dynamics. And maybe on some level they understood this was a human experiment. But I think once they created that world, the external perception rightfully was that they had made a model society. And that as you look into that society, these questions of a life cycle, of generations, of diversity, and diversity of experience and background, but also of politics and economy, like decision-making, leadership, prioritization, profit maximization versus long-term interest. All of these things were really unresolved because I think the focus was on creating an ecosystem, but that the human dimension and the societal dimension is inextricable from the natural element. And I haven't had an opportunity to talk about it that much, and mostly because I do Q&As largely with the participants of the project. And it's been interesting having conversations with people now that the film's come out.
Fascinating. I'm glad you brought up that. I'm glad you brought up the whiteness, because that's obviously glaring, and you made a conscious effort to have the critique from the young Black girl who says, "What does?"
Oh my
this
God, that
have to
shot's
do?"
amazing. Yeah.
It's so good. I'm so glad you
because it's so
different
90s.
context.
It's also so 90s too.
Her t-shirt and everything.
Well, also there's this media clip that I always thought was just so funny of the newscaster saying a diverse group of people, and it pans over all these white people. It's so like, huh?
That's what I was going to ask you about. He says that there's ethnic diversity in that clip. What is he talking about?
Does he say ethnic, or does he just say diverse? I mean, I think the newscaster, because there was like a German and British person, was saying they're diverse, but I used it as a means to acknowledge just
maybe he says cultural, but I think he says
it was absurd, and it's an interesting reflection of 90s media identity politics in the 90s as represented in mainstream media. But yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of just a very particular conversation I had yesterday with two friends, and thinking about the colonial aspect of so much of the work, and how there was not. I think this is true of the Back to the Land counterculture movement of the 70s too, going back to the land, to indigenous land, or building a ship and doing projects all over the world and in different cultures, like building a hotel in Kathmandu, etc. And I think even the idea of space colonization, there is a colonial aspect to that as well. And I was thinking, I wonder how the film could have addressed that in a different way. It's a theme that the film doesn't go into necessarily, but yeah, it's in so many ways that project, not just the aesthetics of it is dated, and in other ways, the project is a futurist project. It imagined a future that is very much happening right now, not only because we're quarantined, but because the ideas of people operating through private venture to pursue like futurist projects, even space colonization, are actually happening. And the concerns that they recognized in the early 80s about catastrophic climate change are so tangible and real now. So there's at once a kind of prescience and futurism to the project, but something kind of outdated about so many aspects of it as well. And that tension interests me.
Yeah, and I think you do, even though I don't think you go into much of a critique about it, you do somehow the space colonization makes the rest of the colonial aspects so clear. I mean, at this point, it just, and of course it also brings up this the hippies to the tech companies and people like Elon Musk and his wanting to colonize Mars, and that was their goal too. And it's so disturbing to see those patterns replicated on a.
And I was also I've used the word neoliberal to describe it, and a friend yesterday was like, neoliberal isn't the right word. Conscious capitalism is the rhetoric that people sometimes use. Like this idea that this model in which they were trying to be economically and ecologically sustainable through doing this as a private enterprise outside of academia or the government, it enabled them to operate in such an experimental way at such a fast speed. But at the end of the day, it proved not to be successful. The economic realities of this ambitious project were not sustainable, and the project was taken away from them. And I do think it's a very contemporary dilemma, this idea that capitalism can coexist with sustainability, and that we can solve the world's problems in ways that make money. I don't really believe that does work. And I think this project was a interesting case study in that.
Absolutely. I mean, and you just said it was unusual for the counterculture, but in a way it was so typical for the counterculture. I mean, this is all boomers. This is that idealism and capitalism like merging together, and eventually, and it's just their idealism stuck around longer with their capitalism. I wanted to you've been doing Q&As with the participants, and I wonder if I'm sure this has come up, but for our audience, have they given any tips on this quarantine life from after spending 8 years in a space 2 years with 8 people? Have people asked, have they answered any tips?
Yeah, and it's funny because one of them lives at Synergia Ranch with all the characters of the film, and they're obviously in a pod. And then the other lives in Oracle, Arizona, 10 minutes away from Biosphere 2 in a very rural community. So their lives actually in this quarantine haven't shifted that much. But one thing they said that I think is useful is that they always created opportunities for feasts. And like, if there was a birthday party, there'd be a feast. If there was a holiday, there'd be a feast. But there were definitely months where there wasn't anything to celebrate, and they would make up something to have a feast about. And I think I haven't done that, but I see why it's a good idea. Or I had my birthday during the quarantine, but I think like to create special occasions and to use food as an opportunity to celebrate them is kind of a good idea, even if there aren't actual holidays to celebrate, but to kind of make them up. I thought that is good advice.
It's great advice for cultural institutions too.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Okay, we're going to start opening it up to questions. Let's see. We have a question on YouTube. There's so much great material in this film. Did Matt ever feel pressure or desire to go the docu-series route?
I did. In fact, I pitched it as a docuseries and it wasn't greenlit, and I'm so relieved. I mean, there's more material, there's more story, actually. There's a lot more stuff, but I really appreciate having to show some restraint and to choose a focus on it. I really think it could have gotten geeky or just too baroque of a story, and I had to simplify it, even though it's still a 2-hour film. And you know, my problem with doc series is they're always too long, obviously, but they always peter out. It's rare that a doc series, I didn't watch Tiger King, so I don't know if that peters out, but basically they always they've tried to milk it for so long, there's never an ending. It's just kind of peters out. And I thought that was actually the biggest creative challenge of this film. And we were talking about that with the group still being together, is that the project gets taken over and it sort of just ends. And it's kind of like, dun dun. And you need to kind of wrap it up to find meaning out of the whole story, to make it bigger than just Biosphere 2. But that's not, you can't do that for 45 minutes. You know, it's like 10 minutes. So I think part of the shortcomings of most doc series is that they kind of peter out and don't have strong endings because they try to stretch out the story too much. The OJ series is a rare example of something that's not like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, there's another question, this time on Zoom in the Q&A box. This is a fun question because I know you just did an event related to this. It says, did you consider acknowledging the film Biodome in some way with Pauly Shore, right?
Well, I just did a virtual Q&A with Pauly Shore, which is one of the most bizarre things I've ever done. And I didn't consider putting it in the film, but when I was making the film, everyone was like, you mean Biodome? Nobody had heard of Biosphere 2. They had all heard of Biodome. And now that I've made the film, I realize some people have definitely heard of Biosphere 2, but Biodome, even though it's like a pretty critically reviled film, is really ingrained in people's memories. A lot of people use it as a reference point.
It came up when we were going to program the film as well.
Yeah, yeah. Check it.
Amazing.
If you want to see me and Pauly Shore in conversation, it's on YouTube.
Okay, we will post that and your article that you mentioned. You did an article.
Oh
as
yeah,
a
yeah.
filmmaker about
on
these
Zooming.
Q&As. Let's see. We have. I also. Well, do you want to say anything about what you're working on next, or is it too soon?
It's too soon. Lots of things in the what do you call it? Preheating. The oven is preheating.
That makes sense. Let me see what else we have. Okay, I think that we're running. Let's see. Does anyone have any other questions? We have a shy group tonight.
No pressure.
Yeah. Well, I think that we'll go ahead and end it at this, but I want to say happy birthday to you, Max, since you said
thank
you just had your birthday.
Last week, thank you.
That's wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us. This was really fun to talk to you about this.
Yeah,
and
thank you so much for having me.
It was really a pleasure. And we hope to have you really in Memphis when we can.
So, yeah, that would be great.
And I want to let everyone know that our film next week is a film. We're doing a film for the Netflix release of Uncut Gems. We'll be talking with Julia Fox, one of the stars of that film. So that should be really fun. And so join us again at 8:00 Central. And thank you again, Matt. It was really wonderful to talk to you. And I hope
good to see you. And thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.